St. Augustine, Florida. Late August, 1945. The summer heat is suffocating, pressing against the windows of the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind like something trying to get in. In a small classroom on the second floor, a 14-year-old boy sits alone at a wooden desk, his fingers tracing the raised dots of a Braille music sheet. His name is Ray Charles Robinson, and he's counting the days until he can go home and see his mother. The cicadas are screaming outside. The ceiling fan is barely moving. Sweat is rolling down Ray's forehead, but he doesn't wipe it away. He's too focused on the music. Chopin. A nocturne. The notes flow through his fingers like water, each dot a promise of something beautiful. Then the door opens. Ray's head turns toward the sound. Footsteps. Slow. Hesitant. The kind of footsteps that carry bad news. He knows the rhythm of every teacher in this school. He can tell who's coming by the weight of their step, the speed of their gait, the way their shoes hit the wooden floor. These footsteps belong to Mrs. Henderson, the assistant principal. And something is wrong. He can hear it in the way she pauses at the doorway. He can feel it in the silence that follows. "Ray," she says, and her voice cracks on his name. "I need you to come with me." The boy stands up. He doesn't ask why. He already knows. Somewhere deep in his gut, in that place where the body understands things before the mind catches up, he already knows. The walk down the hallway takes forever. Each step echoes. Each breath feels heavy. Ray's hand trails along the wall, counting the doorframes, navigating by touch and memory. Mrs. Henderson walks beside him, not speaking, her silence louder than any words. In the principal's office, there's a man Ray doesn't recognize. His voice is low, official, the voice of someone who has delivered this kind of news before. "Son, I'm sorry to tell you this. Your mother passed away this morning." Ray doesn't move. He doesn't speak. He doesn't cry. He just stands there, frozen, feeling the world collapse around him. Feeling the darkness that was already his constant companion grow even darker, even heavier, even more complete. Aretha Robinson was only 31 years old. Cancer had been eating her alive for months, quietly, mercilessly, while her blind son was 160 miles away learning to read music he couldn't see. She hadn't told him she was sick. She didn't want to worry him. She was trying to hold on long enough to see her boy one more time. She didn't make it. And in that moment, standing in a principal's office in St. Augustine, Ray Charles lost the only person in the world who had ever believed he could be something. The only voice that had ever told him, "You're blind, you ain't dumb. You lost your sight, not your mind." What happened in the days that followed would push Ray Charles to the edge of madness. He wouldn't eat. He wouldn't sleep. He wouldn't speak. He would later call it his only true nervous breakdown, the only time in his life when he genuinely thought he was losing his mind. And it would change everything about who he was going to become. To understand what that loss meant to Ray Charles, you need to understand what his mother was. Not just who she was, but what she represented. Because Aretha Robinson wasn't just a parent. She was the architect of Ray's survival. She was the voice in his head that told him he wasn't broken. And without her, he had no blueprint for how to exist in this world. Aretha's own story was a tragedy before Ray was even born. It was the kind of story that should have destroyed her. The kind of story that destroyed a lot of women in the Deep South in those days. She lost her mother when she was just a girl. Her father, too poor and too broken to care for a child alone, made a decision that would haunt the family for generations. He handed his little girl over to a man named Bailey Robinson and his wife Mary Jane. They were supposed to raise her like their own daughter. They promised to give her a home, an education, a future. Instead, Bailey raped her when she was 15 years old. Aretha became pregnant. A scandal erupted in the small town of Greenville, Florida, the kind of scandal that ruined lives, that made people whisper behind closed doors and point fingers in the streets. Aretha fled to Albany, Georgia, where she had family who would take her in. And there, on September 23, 1930, she gave birth to Ray Charles Robinson. A child born from violence. A child born into poverty. A child born into a world that had already decided he didn't matter. But here's the part of the story that nobody talks about. The part that seems almost impossible to understand. After Ray was born, Aretha did something extraordinary. Something that defied logic and reason and self-preservation. She went back. She returned to Greenville. To the house where she had been violated. To the community that had shamed her. And she set up a life with Mary Jane Robinson, Bailey's wife. The two women, united by circumstance and survival and something that might have been forgiveness, raised Ray together. Bailey himself had fled, married another woman somewhere else, disappeared from the story like the coward he was. Ray would later call Aretha Mama and Mary Jane Mother. Two women. Two different kinds of love. Mother was gentle, indulgent, always ready to help. But it was Mama who shaped him. It was Mama who refused to let him be helpless. It was Mama who saw something in her blind, traumatized son that nobody else could see. When Ray was 5 years old, tragedy struck for the first time. He was playing in the backyard with his younger brother George, near the big metal washtub where Mama scrubbed clothes for the white families across town. The water was gray with soap. George was 4 years old, curious and fearless, leaning over the edge to see his reflection. And then George slipped. Ray tried to pull him out. He grabbed his brother's arms and pulled with everything he had. But George was already weighted down by his wet clothes, sinking deeper into the soapy water. Ray was just a little boy with little hands. He wasn't strong enough. He wasn't fast enough. George drowned in his mother's washtub while Ray watched, helpless, screaming for Mama to come save them. She came running. But it was too late. A year later, Ray started going blind. Glaucoma, probably, though nobody could afford to diagnose it properly. The light began to fade from his eyes, day by day, week by week. Colors disappeared first. Then shapes. Then shadows. By the time he was 7 years old, Ray Charles Robinson was living in complete darkness. He would later remember the exact moment he knew it was over. He walked outside one afternoon, looked up at the sky, and stared directly into the sun. It didn't hurt. There was no blinding brightness, no pain, no instinct to look away. Just a dim, orange glow where there should have been fire. The sun had gone out. And it was never coming back. Most mothers would have collapsed under that weight. A dead son. A blind son. No money. No education. No hope. The poverty in Greenville was crushing. Even compared to other blacks, Ray would later write, we were at the bottom of the ladder. Nothing below us except the ground. But Aretha Robinson was not most mothers. Instead of treating Ray like a victim, she treated him like a survivor. Instead of doing everything for him, she made him do it himself. She forced him to continue his chores, drawing water from the well, bringing in the firewood, navigating the house and the yard and the neighborhood. When he fell, she didn't run to pick him up. She waited. She watched. She let him find his own way back to his feet. You're blind, she told him. You ain't dumb. You lost your sight, not your mind. Those 6 words became Ray's compass. They became the voice in his head that answered every doubt, every fear, every moment when he wanted to give up. They would echo in his mind for the next 70 years, through poverty and fame, through addiction and recovery, through heartbreak and triumph. You're blind. You ain't dumb. Aretha couldn't read or write. She had no education, no money, no connections. But she had something more powerful than any of those things. She had an unshakable belief that her son was not broken. And she was willing to do whatever it took to give him a chance. She walked miles to knock on doors. She begged officials. She pleaded with bureaucrats. She searched for a school, any school, that would accept a blind African American child in the segregated South of the 1930s. Most places turned her away. Some laughed in her face. Others didn't even bother to respond. Finally, she found the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind in St. Augustine. It was 160 miles away. Ray would have to live there most of the year, coming home only for summers and holidays. The state would pay for everything, room, board, education, even the train fare. It broke Aretha's heart to send her boy away. Ray was 7 years old, blind, and terrified. He cried when she put him on the train. He begged her not to make him go. But she knew it was his only chance. At that school, he could learn to read and write in Braille. He could learn to take care of himself. He could learn music. I'll be here when you come back, she promised him. I'll always be here. For the next 8 years, Ray lived at the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind. He learned to read music in Braille, a painstaking process where you can only feel a few bars at a time, where you have to memorize everything because you can't play and read simultaneously. He mastered the piano, then the clarinet, then the saxophone, then the trumpet. He studied Chopin and Beethoven. He listened to Nat King Cole and Art Tatum on the radio. He absorbed everything, gospel from the churches, blues from the jukeboxes, country from the fields, jazz from the nightclubs. By the time he was 12, Ray could arrange big band music. By 14, he was composing his own pieces. The teachers called him gifted. The other students called him a prodigy. But Ray just called himself lucky, lucky to have found the one thing that made the darkness bearable. And every summer, every holiday, he came home to Greenville. Home to Mama. Home to the woman whose voice was the only light he had left. The summer of 1945 was supposed to be like all the others. Ray was 14 years old, finishing another school year, counting the days until he could feel Mama's presence again. Not see her, he couldn't see anything. But feel her. Hear her voice. Smell the soap she used for laundry. Feel her calloused hands on his face. What Ray didn't know, what Aretha had hidden from everyone, was that she had been sick for months. The cancer had started in her stomach and spread everywhere. She was 31 years old, and she was dying. The doctors in Greenville couldn't do anything. The hospitals in Tallahassee wouldn't treat a poor black woman. So Aretha just kept working, kept washing clothes, kept pretending everything was fine, kept holding on until she could see her boy one more time. She didn't make it. On August 31, 1945, Aretha Robinson died in Greenville, Florida. She was buried in the Greenville Pallbearers Cemetery, in a simple grave that most of the world would never know existed. And 160 miles away, her blind son was about to learn that promises don't always survive the people who make them. Ray Charles would later describe the days after his mother's death as the only time in his life he truly lost his mind. Not when his brother drowned. Not when he went blind. Not when he spent 17 years addicted to heroin. None of that compared to losing Mama. For days I couldn't talk, think, sleep, or eat, he told his biographer David Ritz. I was sure enough going crazy. I knew my world had ended. The school arranged for him to travel back to Greenville for the funeral. Ray sat on the train in complete silence, hour after hour, the darkness pressing against him from all sides. He was 14 years old, blind, and completely alone. His brother was dead. His mother was dead. His father had abandoned him before he could walk. There was nobody left who loved him the way Mama had loved him. When he arrived in Greenville, Mary Jane, mother, met him at the station. She held him. She cried. But it wasn't the same. It wasn't Mama's arms. It wasn't Mama's voice. It wasn't Mama's strength. The funeral was held at the New Shiloh Baptist Church, the same church where Ray had first heard gospel music, the same church where Mama had taken him every Sunday before he went away to school. The wooden pews were packed with neighbors and friends, people who had known Aretha since she was a girl, people who had watched her raise two boys in impossible circumstances. Ray sat in the front row, wearing his best clothes, his face a mask of stone. The preacher spoke about Aretha's strength, her faith, her love for her children. The choir sang hymns that Ray had known his whole life. People wept. People prayed. And Ray couldn't cry. He wanted to. God knows he wanted to. The grief was there, pressing against his chest like a physical weight, threatening to crush him. But the tears wouldn't come. It was as if his body had shut down, refusing to acknowledge what his mind already knew. Refusing to accept that Mama was really gone. When they carried the coffin to the cemetery, Ray followed, his hand on Mother's arm, navigating by sound and touch. The ground was uneven. The grass was dry. Somewhere nearby, a bird was singing, oblivious to the tragedy unfolding beneath its branch. At the graveside, Ray listened to the final prayers. He heard the ropes creak as the coffin was lowered into the ground. He smelled the fresh earth, the pine of the wooden box, the flowers wilting in the August heat. And then he did something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. He knelt down, reached out his hand, and felt for the edge of the grave. He scooped up a handful of dirt, red Florida clay, still warm from the sun, and let it fall onto the casket. The sound it made was soft, final, like a door closing forever. That was his goodbye. Silent. Physical. The only way a blind boy could say farewell to the woman who had taught him to see the world without eyes. Ray returned to school after the funeral, but he wasn't the same person. The model student, the quiet, disciplined boy who practiced piano for hours and never caused trouble, was gone. In his place was someone angry, rebellious, and reckless. Someone who wanted the world to hurt as much as he did. He started playing pranks. He talked back to teachers. He broke rules that he had followed for 8 years without question. He got into fights with other students. He refused to do his homework. He stopped practicing music. The teachers tried to be patient. They understood he was grieving. They made allowances, gave second chances, looked the other way when they could. But Ray pushed and pushed, testing every limit, daring them to throw him out. On October 5, 1945, just 5 weeks after his mother's death, the school finally had enough. Ray Charles Robinson was expelled from the Florida School for the Deaf and the Blind. The official record was brief and cold: sent home. Unsatisfactory pupil. He was 15 years old. Blind. Orphaned. Cast out. He had no home to go back to. The house in Greenville belonged to memories now, not to any future he could imagine. He had no family who could take care of him. He had nothing except the skills he'd learned at that school and the voice in his head that still whispered Mama's words. "You're blind. You ain't dumb." Mary Jane Robinson saved him. Mother, the woman who had helped raise him, the gentle one, the indulgent one, refused to let him disappear into the darkness. She knew a woman in Jacksonville named Lena Mae Thompson who took in boarders. She arranged for Ray to live with the Thompsons and try to make a living as a musician. Jacksonville was the biggest city in Florida. It had clubs, bars, theaters, dance halls. It had a musicians' union. It had a music scene that was rough and competitive and didn't care whether you could see or not, as long as you could play. Ray got a job playing piano at the Ritz Theater in La Villa, the black neighborhood in Jacksonville. He earned $4 a night, about $47 in today's money, playing for crowds who wanted to dance, who wanted to forget their troubles, who didn't care that the kid at the piano was blind as long as he could make them feel something. He joined the Musicians Union, Local 632 of the American Federation of Musicians. He practiced at their hall every day, learning licks from the older players, absorbing their techniques, stealing their tricks. The jam sessions were brutal. Stomp or be stomped, the musicians called them. Get your chops together or go home. Ray got his chops together. He played anywhere they'd have him. White clubs where he had to enter through the kitchen and perform behind a curtain so the audience couldn't see his black face. Black clubs where the whiskey flowed and the music never stopped. Whorehouses where men played cards and drank moonshine while Ray provided the soundtrack. He played for drunks and hustlers and pimps and working girls and anyone else who had $4 and wanted to hear some piano. He was 15, 16, 17 years old. A blind teenager navigating a world designed for people who could see, using nothing but his ears, his fingers, and his mother's voice echoing in his head. You're blind. You ain't dumb. You lost your sight, not your mind. In 1947, at 17 years old, Ray made a decision that would change everything. He'd been scraping by in Florida for 2 years, playing gigs, building a reputation, but always feeling like he was trapped. Trapped by the memories. Trapped by the ghosts. Trapped by the shadow of Greenville and everything he'd lost there. He wanted to go somewhere else. Somewhere far away. Somewhere the past couldn't follow him. He asked a friend to look at a map and find the city that was farthest from Tampa without leaving the country. The answer was Seattle, Washington. 3,000 miles away. A place Ray had never been, where nobody knew his name, where nobody knew his story. He bought a bus ticket with every dollar he had saved. He packed a small bag with everything he owned. And he got on a Greyhound bus that would carry him across the entire country, a blind 17-year-old with no money, no connections, and no plan except to keep moving until the pain stopped following him. The bus ride took days. Ray sat by the window he couldn't see out of, listening to the sounds of America rolling past. The hum of the engine. The chatter of passengers. The silence of the desert at night. Somewhere in Texas, he got off to use a restroom and was told he had to use the colored entrance around back. Somewhere in Arizona, a waitress refused to serve him because of his skin. Somewhere in California, he realized he was finally too far from Florida for anyone to care who he was. He arrived in Seattle with almost nothing. But Seattle gave him something Florida never had, a chance to start over. He formed a trio. He started recording. He developed the sound that would eventually make him famous, that raw, raspy voice, that piano style that mixed church and jukebox, that fusion of gospel and blues that nobody had ever quite heard before. He also discovered heroin there. It numbed the pain that never went away. It filled the emptiness that Mama's death had left behind. For the next 17 years, Ray Charles would fight an addiction that nearly destroyed him, but that's another story. The drugs didn't define him. The pain didn't break him. Because somewhere deep inside, his mother's voice kept playing on a loop, like a record that never wore out. In 1954, Ray Charles signed with Atlantic Records and recorded I've Got a Woman. It was the birth of soul music, a sound that combined the passion of gospel with the grit of blues in a way that made critics gasp and audiences weep. It was the sound of a blind man who had lost everything except his belief that he wasn't broken. By 1960, he had recorded Georgia on My Mind, a song about longing, about home, about the places we can never truly go back to. The same Georgia where his mother had given birth to him, unwed and ashamed, 30 years earlier. The same Georgia that had witnessed her scandal and her flight and her impossible return. In April 1979, something happened that would have seemed impossible to the 15-year-old boy who was expelled from school and told he had no future. Ray Charles was invited to the Georgia State Legislature to perform Georgia on My Mind as it was officially declared the state song. He walked onto the floor of the legislature, took his seat at the piano, and began to play. Politicians who had grown up with segregation, men and women who remembered when a black man couldn't drink from the same fountain as a white man, sat in stunned silence. And then they began to cry. Ray couldn't see their tears. But he could feel them. He could feel the weight of history in that room, the weight of everything his mother had endured, the weight of everything he had overcome. And for the first time in 34 years, he let himself think about Mama without flinching. By the time Ray Charles died on June 10, 2004, he had won 17 Grammy Awards. He had been inducted into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Frank Sinatra had called him the only true genius in show business. Billy Joel had said he was more important than Elvis Presley. He had sold millions of records, performed for presidents, changed the course of American music. But when interviewers asked him about his greatest influence, he always gave the same answer. Not Duke Ellington. Not Nat King Cole. Not Art Tatum or Count Basie or any of the legends he had studied and admired. My mother, he would say. Everything I am, I owe to my mother. Aretha Robinson couldn't read. She couldn't write. She died in poverty at 31 years old, in a small town nobody remembers, buried in a cemetery that history forgot. She never saw her son become famous. She never heard him win a Grammy. She never knew that her voice, her 6 simple words, would echo through 60 years of musical history. But she gave him something that no amount of money or fame could buy. She gave him the belief that he wasn't broken. She gave him permission to be extraordinary. She gave him a compass that pointed toward greatness even when he couldn't see the path. You're blind, she said. You ain't dumb. You lost your sight, not your mind. 6 words. That's all it took to create a genius. Ray Charles spent his entire life proving those 6 words true. He conquered genres. He broke barriers. He made the world understand that blindness was nothing, nothing at all, compared to the vision that lived inside his heart. And every time he sat down at a piano, every time his fingers found the keys, every time that raspy voice poured out the pain and joy and sorrow and triumph of his existence, he was having a conversation with a woman who had been dead for decades. Look at me, Mama. Look at what I did. Look at what you made possible. She couldn't look. Neither could he. But they saw each other anyway. In the music. In the silence between the notes. In the space where love doesn't need eyes to be real. Rest in peace, Mama. Your boy did good.